They came to that dry riverbed armed and bitter, ready to spill blood over old wounds and whispered fears. Guns cocked, arrows drawn. One spark, and the desert would have burned. But then, a sound, not a shout, not a shot, a drum, soft, steady, played by a child barely old enough to walk. He stepped between enemies. No fear, no words, just rhythm. And the west held its breath. The sky dimmed, the wind circled, even the earth trembled. Some say it was prophecy, others pure madness. But I was there, and I'll tell you the truth. That day, a boy with fire on his shoulder silenced 100 rifles. That was the day a child stopped a war. The wind blew hard across the Ridgefall Basin, kicking up sheets of dust that shimmered like ghosts in the dying light. In the shadow of a twisted Joshua tree, a girl knelt, belly round, face streaked with soot, eyes open but unfocused. Her dark hair was tangled with twigs, her dress torn along the hem. She could have been any lost soul, but there was something about the way she sat, still, almost reverent, as if the earth were whispering to her and she was trying to listen. Her name was Mira, half Navajo, half settler, and wholly unwelcome in the town that had raised her to fear her own blood. They said she talked to the wind like it talked back, that she never cried, never begged, never named the father of the child growing inside her. One preacher called her a vessel of sin and locked the church doors behind her when she came pleading for help. Another neighbor spit at her feet and muttered the word witch like it was spit-soaked tobacco. Now, cast out and alone, Mira sat beneath the crooked tree, the only thing standing between her and the open sky. From the ridge above, vultures circled. The wind twisted through the rocks like it carried a warning. And then, hooves. Elias Rowe didn't believe in omens. He'd seen too much death to put stock in signs. What he did believe in was quiet, the kind that settled after a funeral or before a gunfight, the kind that hung heavy between two people when no words could undo what had been lost. At 41, Elias had buried more than most. A wife stolen by fever, a daughter taken by fire when their cabin was torched in a feud over land no man ever truly owned. He lived now past the old creek bed, alone with his mule Boaz, a scatter of fence posts, and a cabin no one visited. He wasn't looking for company, but fate doesn't knock. Sometimes it just waits beneath a tree. He spotted Mira in the low light, half collapsed in the dirt, arms braced around her belly, lips cracked, but her gaze fixed straight ahead. She looked at him, steady, unblinking, like she knew he'd stop, and without a word he did. Elias dismounted slowly, his boots crunching dry gravel. "You lost, or?" he asked, voice low, more gravel than question. Mira didn't answer. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Her hands never left her belly. "I ain't here to hurt you," he added, still nothing. He crouched, keeping distance. "You from Ridgefall?" Her lips parted. One word. "Not anymore." He gave a single nod. "What's your name?" "Mira." It was enough. He extended a calloused hand. "Can you walk?" She hesitated, then nodded. With care, he helped her up. She winced but didn't cry out. He steadied her with one hand and picked up her bundle with the other. A scrap blanket, half a loaf of dried bread, and a small carved talisman shaped like a flame, wrapped in red cloth. Without another word, he led her to the mule and lifted her onto the saddle. No words passed between them, but something deeper than thanks moved in the silence. The storm behind them was rising, and it had nothing to do with weather. They rode in silence, the sky darkening in slow bruises above. And as they crossed the basin toward Elias's cabin, the dust curled behind them like a forgotten trail being erased by wind. The cabin smelled of cedar, smoke, and something older. Grief that had settled into the floorboards and refused to leave. Elias didn't speak much the first few days, and neither did Mira. They moved around each other like shadows, separate, silent, necessary. Mira slept on the cot. Elias took the floor by the hearth. He didn't argue about it after that first night, though he grumbled when she tried to do chores. She swept the porch, mended the worn quilt with thread she found in an old crate, and gathered dried herbs in a pouch made from an old feed sack. Elias noticed but said nothing. Then one afternoon, while chopping wood behind the shed, he found strange markings scratched into the outer wall. A spiral, a black sun with jagged rays, a hand with 3 dots falling from its palm. He stared at them for a long moment, not angry, not afraid, just curious and tired. Later, as Mira sat near the fire, Elias nodded toward the door. "Those yours?" She didn't look up. "They're prayers," she said, "for protection, for peace." "From who?" She hesitated. "Not from, with." He didn't press. He didn't understand most of what she said, but he listened. Over time, Mira's habits became familiar. She whispered to sagebrush, pressed her ear to stones as if the earth itself spoke secrets. At first, Elias thought it strange. Then he realized it wasn't much stranger than how he sometimes talked to his dead wife when the wind howled too long. The silence between them shifted. It wasn't empty now. It was waiting. One cold morning, as frost dusted the windows, Mira noticed something on a shelf near Elias's workbench. It was covered in an old cloth, forgotten and dusted with cobwebs. She lifted the edge just a little. A wooden horse, hand-carved, dulled with time. The paint was chipped, but the detail was delicate. The grain of the mane, the curve of its legs in mid-gallop. "You made this?" she asked softly. Elias stood behind her, arms crossed, face unreadable. "For my daughter?" he said, his voice low. Mira didn't reply. She just set the horse down carefully, like it might break if she breathed wrong. That night, he didn't take the floor. He sat by the fire instead, the horse in his lap, whittling the edge with a small knife. They ate in silence, but something had changed. Small things followed. Mira handed him wild mint for his tea without asking. He left a folded blanket on her cot before the frost came in. She stacked the firewood in tight rows. He repaired the back hinge on the outhouse she always avoided. It was never spoken. But day by day, they became two people surviving not beside each other, but with each other. And one evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridge in that deep blue hush before stars, Elias looked at Mira, her hands stained from drawing charcoal symbols on the porch beams, and said quietly, "You really believe the wind listens?" She met his gaze steady. "Don't you?" He didn't answer, but he didn't say no either. It started with the birds, or rather the absence of them. Elias noticed it first while fixing the gate latch. No morning calls, no wing beats in the mesquite, just a thick, unnatural stillness. Boaz, his mule, wouldn't drink from the trough. The chickens didn't move from the coop, heads tilted sideways like they were listening for something the human ear couldn't catch. Mira stood on the porch barefoot, her hand resting over her swollen belly. Her face, usually quiet and guarded, now held a kind of knowing. "The sun's forgetting," she whispered. Elias glanced at her, squinting. "What?" She turned, her voice low but firm. "He'll come when the sun forgets itself." Before he could question her further, the wind changed. Not strong, but sudden, curling in from the north like breath before a scream. That night, Elias lay awake in his cot, his back to the fire, listening to the shifting air and the whisper of Mira's charcoal on wood. She hadn't slept in days, drawing more symbols, stronger ones, spirals with flame at their center, a circle divided into 4 shadows, a handprint facing the sky. The air was heavy, not hot, just expectant. By midday, the light had begun to turn. It wasn't the fading of twilight, but something else entirely, like the color had been bled from the sun itself. The sky dimmed in a way that made shadows stretch unnaturally long. Boaz brayed and kicked against the barn door. A fox darted across the ridge, then froze mid-run, ears flat. Inside the cabin, Elias sharpened his knife, an old habit when nerves came knocking. But his hands trembled, his breath hitched. He couldn't stop thinking about the fire. His fire. The night his cabin burned and he cradled what was left of his daughter, ash in his palms, smoke in his eyes. No prayers came, no salvation, just silence and ruin. He'd sworn never to hold another child, never again feel that weight, only to lose it. And now, here he was. "Mira," he said, half turning, but her face had already gone pale. She gasped, doubled over, her hands on the table. A thin line of sweat traced her temple. "It's time," she said. "Now?" "The sun," she rasped. It's gone." Elias rushed to her side, catching her before she collapsed. Through the cabin's only window, he saw the sky, dark like dusk, but too sudden, too wrong. The sun was there but veiled, covered in a black disk edged in burning gold. An eclipse. He laid Mira on the cot, his hands fumbling with the blankets. She clutched his wrist hard enough to leave marks. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. "You'll know," she said, eyes fierce through the pain. "He'll know." Outside, the world held its breath. Inside, she labored in silence. No screams, no curses, just breath. Just Mira, eyes wide, body trembling, her hands never leaving her belly. Elias sat by her side, wiping her brow, whispering useless comforts. His chest ached with fear. But underneath it, something else was rising, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And then, just as the last ring of sunlight slipped behind shadow, Ashen was born. He didn't cry. He just blinked, eyes wide, steady, and breathed. Elias lifted him carefully. The child's skin was warm, pulse strong, body wrapped in the blanket Mira had sewn by hand. On his left shoulder, just beneath the blade, a red mark blazed faintly, shaped like a flickering flame. Not a bruise, not a rash, a birthmark, a symbol. Mira reached for him with shaking arms. Her smile was faint, radiant through exhaustion. "He's here," she whispered. "The one the wind promised." Ashen never spoke, but everyone who met him swore he understood more than most who did. He moved through the world like a spirit in flesh, watching everything, absorbing sound, shadow, and silence with the same wide, steady gaze. When coyotes barked at the ridge, he turned toward them long before the others heard. When the chickens scattered, he was already pulling Mira's hand toward the door. It wasn't just intuition, it was something older, something Mira called listening with the blood. Animals followed him, not in packs or frenzy, but with trust. A wounded jackrabbit once hobbled up to the porch and sat beside him, unafraid. When Boaz the mule grew sick one spring, Ashen slept near its stall for 3 nights. By the 4th morning, Boaz was walking again. Elias noticed. He didn't say it aloud, but he noticed. At dusk, Mira would take Ashen out beneath the cottonwoods and teach him rhythms. Drumming with sticks on wood, tapping patterns with fingers on stone. She showed him Navajo signs, circles that meant balance, hands that meant peace, a star crossed with a line for journey. Ashen never asked questions, but he remembered everything. Then came the visit. It was a Sunday morning when the rider came. No dust trail, no warning. A lone man in ochre robes with beaded braids and leather boots worn flat. He rode a white horse that didn't flinch when Elias stepped out with his rifle slung over his shoulder. The man dismounted slowly and gave a small bow. "I seek the boy," he said. Mira emerged, Ashen on her hip. He looked at the rider without fear. The man's face softened. He knelt, not to Mira, not to Elias, but to the child. "Naachi higi," he whispered in reverence. Mira's eyes welled. "The fire that listens," she translated. The man nodded. "Born during the forgetting sun, marked by flame. He is not ours, and yet he is everyone's." Elias watched, unsure whether to feel honored or terrified. That night, Elias found himself sitting by the fire long after Mira and Ashen had gone to sleep. He stared at the embered logs, his hand wrapped tight around a mug of coffee gone cold. Outside, the stars blinked between clouds. A breeze rustled the cottonwoods like a voice half remembered. He couldn't stop thinking about the word, prophet, marked, born of silence. 2 days later, the warning arrived. Carved into the fence post near their south field, letters jagged and burned in ash. "No more half-blood prophets." Elias stared at it, jaw clenched. His hands tightened on the reins of the cart he was driving back from town. He hadn't heard a word on the road, but the signs were there. Whispers in the saloon, eyes that lingered too long. Fear was spreading. And in the west, fear moved faster than fire. He painted over the graffiti by sundown, but it was too late. At dinner that night, Mira stirred stew in silence. Ashen sat cross-legged on the floor, drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm on the side of the hearth with a spoon. Elias finally spoke. "We need to be careful." Mira didn't turn. We've always been careful. They're afraid, he said, of him. He's just a child. They won't see that. Mira looked up. Then let them go blind. Her voice didn't tremble. But Elias heard the break behind it anyway. The spring had dried too early. Whisper Creek, once a narrow but steady vein through the basin, was nothing but cracked earth and brittle stones. The settlers in Ridgefall blamed the Navajo riders for diverting the water upstream. The Navajo blamed Ridgefall for damming the flow with new fences and cattle lines. Neither side had proof, but in the West, truth rarely mattered more than fear. Within days, weapons were oiled. Words turned sharp. By week's end, they agreed to meet at the place where the stream used to run, Whisper Creek. They called it a meeting. Everyone knew it was a standoff. Elias didn't go. He hadn't picked a side since his land was burned and his family buried in soot. Mira stayed by the hearth, her hands never leaving Ashen's shoulders. The boy was quiet, too quiet. He knows, she said. Elias said nothing, just stared out the window as a dust devil twisted itself thin on the horizon. By mid-afternoon, the house was still. The heat hung low, pressing against the windows like breath. Ashen sat in the corner, his little drum strapped over his chest, watching the door. And then, he was gone. Mira's scream pierced the silence first. The door left ajar, the dust still unsettled, the child's footprints already vanishing in the wind. He's going, she gasped, grabbing her shawl. Elias was already strapping on his boots. To the creek, he said grimly. They rode the mule hard across the basin, hearts pounding faster than hoofbeats. As they crested the ridge above Whisper Creek, Mira cried out. Below, two crowds faced each other, settlers on one side, Navajo riders on the other. Guns, bows, tight jaws, wide eyes. One wrong word, one twitch of a finger, and it would all be over. And in the middle of that canyon of hatred, barefoot and dust-streaked, was Ashen. The toddler walked without fear, drum across his shoulder, flame mark flickering under the sun. He stopped in the exact center of the cracked riverbed, looked up at the sky, then sat down. And he played. The sound was soft, gentle. Not the thunder of war, but the heartbeat of something older. It echoed strangely across the stone. Settlers froze. Riders shifted uneasily. Then, the wind changed. It curled low and slow, as if it were listening. The sky dimmed, not with storm, but with something more ancient. Shadows stretched long. The hairs on every neck stood on end. Ashen sat and began to play, softly, steadily. Not the thunder of war, but the rhythm of something older. The ground shivered beneath him, like even the earth was listening. A moment later, water gurgled. From a place no one could see, a thin stream bubbled up through the cracked stone and flowed toward Ashen's feet. Fresh, cold, real. Gasps broke the silence. Then, rifles lowered, spears dropped. No one spoke. Not even Mira, who stood beside Elias now, hand pressed over her mouth. Elias couldn't breathe. His heart thundered like the war drums he'd heard years ago in battle. But this wasn't war. It was something else. A toddler sat in the dirt, beating a drum, and the world listened. The place where war nearly began became the place they stayed. It wasn't planned. Not at first. But after the boy stopped the violence, after the creek ran again, and the people returned to their homes still breathing, something in the land itself shifted. It no longer felt cursed. It felt open, like it was waiting for something new. Mira was the first to say it aloud. We should build here, she whispered one morning, standing at the center of the riverbed, the rising sun spilling gold over her shawl. Elias, hammer in hand, squinted at the cracked ground. Here, where people nearly shot each other. Exactly here, she said, her voice steady. Because if peace can begin in a place like this, it can grow anywhere. They called it Ashfire Crossing. The name came from the child, of course, Ashen, whose birthmark still glowed faintly when he dreamed. But it also came from the land itself, a place once scorched by anger, now seeded with something softer, something that might survive. Elias built the first cabin by hand, logs notched tight, roof sloped against the wind. Mira planted sagebrush and cottonwood. Ashen wandered barefoot, trailing his drum behind him like a trusted shadow. Soon others came, not because they were invited, because they were called. The first was a woman named Ruth Calder, late 30s, eyes like shattered glass, a ring still clinging to her finger, though the man she'd married had chased her with a rifle. She arrived on a broken cart with a broken rib, said she was just passing through. But when she looked at Ashen, who silently placed a carved bird in her lap, she wept for the first time in years. She stayed. Then came a Union veteran, Sergeant Lowell Riggins. He shook like winter branches, even in spring. Wouldn't sleep indoors. Couldn't hold a cup without spilling half. He'd served at Shiloh, lost 2 brothers in Tennessee, and whatever was left of his soul at Antietam. He didn't speak much, but he whittled small animals in the evenings beside Elias. And when Ashen sat beside him in silence, something in the veteran stilled. He stayed too. And then there was the boy. No name, no voice. Skin burnt along one side, maybe from a barn fire or worse. He never spoke, never smiled, until Mira sang one of her Navajo chants beside the fire. The boy listened. His fingers twitched. And when she handed him a sparkstone and kindling, he struck once, twice, and then sang. Low, guttural, half breath, half tone. As he sang, the fire caught. He didn't leave after that. Ashfire Crossing grew, not like a town, but like a whisper that refused to die. A stopping place between Ridgefall and the high mesas. A space for those with nowhere else to go. No sign marked its entrance. No lawmen patrolled its edge. But word spread among riders, wanderers, widows, and those the world had forgotten. And always, always, it was Ashen who greeted them first. He never said much, just looked at people like he saw them before they could explain themselves. Some said it was prophecy. Elias didn't like that word. He's just a boy, he'd mutter. But late at night, when Ashen curled up by the hearth, the flames flickering against the mark on his shoulder, even Elias had to admit, there was something in the child's stillness that felt eternal. Years slipped by like wind across the basin, slow, steady, without asking permission. The boy who once sat in silence between rifles and spears had grown taller, stronger, though still quiet in ways the world had no language for. His hair was longer now, often tied back with a red thread. His flame-shaped birthmark had faded in color, but never in meaning. Ashen spent his mornings beneath the same twisted Joshua tree where Mira had once nearly died. That tree had grown with them, its branches reaching wider, as if trying to hold all the years they'd survived. On this particular afternoon, Elias sat beneath its shade, cane resting by his knee, breath slower than it used to be. His beard was more white than gray now. The skin on his hands was thin and creased like old leather. Ashen sat nearby, cross-legged, teaching 2 children how to drum. One boy wore a wool vest, freckles scattered across his nose. The other had long black braids and eyes that studied the rhythm with quiet reverence. Neither asked about race, neither asked about names. They just listened and followed. A traveler arrived late that day, thin, dusty, boots worn smooth by road and curiosity. He introduced himself as a scholar collecting stories, truths that had been left behind in the rush to claim land. When he saw Ashen and the children, his eyes narrowed with recognition. He turned to Elias. They say he stopped a war once, the scholar said. Elias gave a tired smile. That's so? They say his mother was a cursed girl, that you took her in when no one else would. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the boy under the tree. People said a lot, he murmured, but the truth is, I had nothing left. I wasn't saving anyone. Mira, she came carrying something holy, and I was just waiting to die slower than most. The scholar jotted something into his notebook. And the child? Elias pointed to Ashen, who now laughed as the 2 children struggled to keep rhythm. If anyone asks why I saved the girl, he said, voice quiet but clear, it's because the child saved me. In times like these, when people argue more than they listen, Ashen's story reminds us of something we may have forgotten. Peace rarely comes from those in power. It often begins with those brave enough to stay still, to listen, and to love when it's hardest. Mira wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. Neither was Elias. They were just two broken people who chose compassion over fear, and in that choice, they changed the world around them. What if we treated today's outcasts the way Elias chose to treat Mira? What if we believed that the children we ignore might carry the wisdom we need? In modern America, with all its division, noise, and loneliness, stories like this challenge us to slow down and reconsider. Let's talk in the comments. Have you ever seen kindness from someone unexpected turn a moment of tension into peace? Share your story in the comments. We read everyone. Your words might be the quiet miracle someone else is waiting for. Ashfire Crossing might be fiction, but the longing it speaks to is very real. Thank you for being part of this journey. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who still believes in quiet miracles. Because sometimes, the greatest revolutions start with a whisper.